Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my worm marine. As you can see, I've got a couple bins out here on the bench already. There are bins that have European nightcrawlers in them. As you can see, they're labeled ENC, ENC1 and ENC2. It's been 12 days since we last checked in on these bins, and their age, well, you can see the start date of the bins right there. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since the 3rd of July?
It was 226 days ago.
Yeah, that's right, 226 days ago. That's how I remembered it. So, we're going to be checking in on these bins. They're due for a feeding. The stuff they got last time was really yummy stuff. Stuff that I'm assuming that they're going to really probably do away with quite quickly. There was stuff like pear. There was strawberry. I also kind of topped off that feeding with some coffee and worm chow. All stuff that I expect is probably going to be gone by this time. And the stuff that they're lined up to get today is right here in this tray. There's some cantaloupe rinds down on the bottom, and on top it's all apple peels. You can even see a couple little pieces of strawberry scattered in here as well. And it's got a lot more weight to it than I thought. When I was putting it in here up in the kitchen, taking it out of the freezer, it didn't seem like that much, but as I picked it up to bring it down here, it seemed like it had a good bit of weight to it, more than I thought. So it's a pretty good size feeding, but when it comes to apple, or at least every time I've tried feeding whole apple, it seems like it takes quite a long time in the worm bin to get consumed. Shredded apple, I don't know, it might go a little bit more quickly. But typically when it comes to giving my worm bins apple, I sort of expect that it's going to take a while. Here we've got a coffee filter, or what's left of it, which had been draped out here across the top to indicate where we last fed. I'm not sure if it's visible on the camera, but there's a very clear, distinct divot here, you know. So we leveled things off, and I guess they've been busy eating the stuff we gave them last time, because I can clearly see a depression down the middle. Something I've tried to get into the habit of doing is to not only, you know, come in here and give them the food, which is typically down the middle, but to also examine the outer edges of the bins just to make sure things aren't going awry. And I did a quick screening of the video I prepared from our last check-in on these bins, and it did look like I had sort of overlooked that quick check on the outer edges. So I figured before I forget again, perhaps it would be a good idea really quick to just begin with a quick check on the outer edges. There's a little bit of a switcheroo here, right? We usually don't do this where there's two bins out on the bench getting fed at once. Normally we just pull up one bin at a time, get it taken care of, put it back on the shelf, bring out the next bin to be fed, and handle them individually. But we tried something different last time we checked in on these systems, and we fed them just like this. We put them side by side, and we kind of opened up both feeding areas, applied all the food at the same time, covered everything up, and it did seem like it worked out pretty good. And it kind of made me feel like I was working inside of a much larger system just by kind of giving everything the same treatment and then applying all of the food right across both bins at the same time. And I don't know, I got some pretty good feedback on how people felt about how that turned out. So I figured I'd just do it again and see if it eventually becomes into something I might want to consider doing more frequently. So the only thing I found out there was that the material was getting a little bit clumpy, so it felt good to be able to sort of till it up and aerate it, I guess might be the right word. Because I get a little concerned when this stuff sort of just sits there and gets clumpy after a while. And the moisture level seems pretty decent over there as well, so I can't complain. And it's mainly castings. I didn't really see a whole lot of anything else out there. There were definitely worms hanging out in this stuff as well. And you know, after 20 feedings and 226 days in service, I guess a year ago, if you were to ask me, hey, what's next for these bins? I would have probably given you an answer or something along the lines of, oh my goodness, they're overdue for harvest. We got to get them primed for harvest. Get the worms working on some fresh material. Remove the castings. But I've been running a lot of my bins well beyond 200 days anymore recently. Even up into the 350, even more. So it's I've kind of desensitize myself to the fact that these worms might be a little bit older than what had typically been the norm in my worm bins. And yeah, 20 feedings would have been very unusual as well. Usually by like the 15th feeding, I was starting to feel like it was really time to, start thinking about getting the worms out and starting them off on some fresh material elsewhere. So here too, I think we're going to follow suit with what we started before, which is to also check the outer edge on this side in both bins. And then we could proceed with giving them the apple and the cantaloupe feeding. I'll be curious to see how that last feeding they got 12 days ago is holding out. Pear I have typically found to be one of those foods that the worms tend to do away with rather quickly. And I thought that there was something else in there, I just can't remember what it was. And even though giving worm bins some bedding at most feedings is a good customary thing to do, I do probably want to start gearing these systems up for harvest at some point in the near future. So I think I am going to be just steering away from adding more bedding today. I think we'll just stick to giving them food only. So here too, I think the material was very similar on the outer edge in both systems. So it felt good to sort of air the stuff up and kind of till it up a little bit, break it loose, because it was starting to get a little bit compacted if nothing else. So the only thing I've encountered so far was a couple pieces of corncob bits when I was excavating over on that side. Other little things that I couldn't really identify, but those were clearly corncob bits. So I think it's time to, I think this is corncob as well. I think it's time to examine how the feeding zone is coming along. All right, we've got ourselves a whole bunch of worms hanging out down here. Maybe even working on some of the food that remains from the last time. There does seem to be a little bit of leftover. Oh, tomato, that's what it was. And that was the one thing I thought that there would be leftovers of. I did actually puncture the skin of every one of these little cherry tomatoes. Here's the stem of a banana. Because I figured if the peel of the tomato or the skin of the tomato was undisturbed, then the worms don't even sense that it's full of delicious moisture and food. They'll just pass it by and look for other stuff. But if it's got a tear in it or a hole in it, I think I might have just gone at each one of these with a little knife and put a little slight gash into each cherry tomato to make sure that it's exposed to the worms. I felt like they'd be, or I guess not completely eaten, but they'd at least be approached by the worms. Some of them still feel like they've got some of the innards remaining. So the worms have not yet nibbled them all clean. So I guess we are left with a little bit of leftover here from the previous feeding, but certainly not a whole lot. And that's where all the worms are. We didn't see many worms when we were examining the outer edges, but the worms are in great numbers around the food that they got last time, which is nice to see. So, and this might be the pear. I think it was pear. It's kind of what it looked like to me when I was applying it, just based on its appearance. It's a little bit surprising that they've not yet done away with all the food they had been given last time. But I don't plan on holding back. I'm going to be giving them all that apple peel that I bought down here for them. Let's do the same over here. Let's see how the leftovers are progressing. Let's open up a spot where we could drop in the food. Here's another corn cob. It's like a stuffed corn cob. It's full of worms. It's so cool. And I think we're probably going to see much the same as far as leftovers. Maybe we'll see a couple chunks of pear, maybe a few little cherry tomatoes that have not really even been very much breached, to have their innards slurped out yet. that's okay. We're going to give them their fair due today. A lot of times I'm not necessarily feeding because I'm concerned that the worms are out of food. It's more like I'm concerned because I'm running out of space in my freezer to store their food. I mean, I'm not totally out of space, but I am definitely running high on inventory as far as stuff that's been set aside for worm feedings. Alright, so I think we've opened up a pretty fair size hole here to put today's food in to, and I guess we'll just start divvying it out here. I think there was going to be maybe 3, and here we go. Sorry, wormies, we're plopping the frozen foods right on top of you guys. I hope they don't mind. Maybe I should start over here. Since I tilled this one up earlier and they've had a chance to retreat out of the bright lights, we'll put the food in here, and that'll give the worms in the other bin a moment or two to get down under the material so that we could put in their food without worrying about freezing them out too badly. Oh, did I crack this thing already? No, good. Sometimes I come down here with a really worn plastic container like this, and this one is still in very good shape. In fact, I don't think it has any breaks in it yet. But it always seems like such a shame when that first crack appears. But I believe it's holding out. So this is probably enough to satisfy the needs of the other bin, but let's complete this feeding here before we move on. Let's just get this little worm off my glove. Not that it makes that big of a difference. All these little tiny baby worms, they really do stick to your glove. So now I've got a little bit of my pulverized eggshell that we can drop into here as grit to aid in the digestion of the foods that they've been given. And then I've got a few days worth of coffee in here, so I'll try to sprinkle in about half and leave the other half for the other system. Alright, I think that's a pretty good, fair divvying up of the coffee supply. And I've got some worm chow here, which is just a variety of different stuff that I put into the little personal blender and grind it all up into a nice powdery consistency. And that's going to be their feeding. So I guess before we cover up, I'm going to see about putting some of these leftovers back down into the hole. These corn cob bits that we stumbled on along the way. I know there's other stuff here. Banana stem, another piece of corn cob, and the rest is, I know there's other bits of food that I bumped into here and there, but those things I couldn't really identify, so I didn't really point them out. And some of it might just be little wads of bedding, like little bundles of shredded paper and cardboard, which I typically try to sort of break apart and dislodge from being in a clump if possible. And here too, it's something that the worms really do seem to enjoy hanging out in. But it also seems like if you have a clump of this stuff, then it's not really going to see much worm traffic. If the stuff inside the clump is not really exposed to the worms, it's going to sit there until the worms are able to gain access to it and reach it. Oops. So here and there is another piece of corn cob bit. So this system's definitely approaching capacity. As you saw, I kind of accidentally pushed a little bit of it over the edge there while I was moving stuff around. And I think that might also be another reason it might be time at some point soon to think about bringing these systems to an end so that we could do a reset, you know, get the castings out of here, get the worms working on a whole fresh new batch of bedding and other stuff that they can begin working down. And now, look at that, all the worms are gone. We can start piling in the frozen foods here without concern about causing any discomfort to any wormies that might have the stuff dropped on top of them. Okay, pretty nice portion. I'll be curious to see how these pieces of apple peel proceed, because right beneath it is going to be melon, which they're probably going to really enjoy, and right above it is going to be coffee and worm chow, which I believe they typically enjoy as well. So that, in a way, makes me question if they're going to be able to even ignore, whether they even would want to ignore the apple peels, because at that point they're going to be, in the throes of enjoying a whole bunch of delicious foods, not to mention the leftovers we're stacking in down here on top of all this stuff. So, let's see, tomatoes, where are all the leftovers? Did I just cover them all up? So I guess we'll just have to see what kind of leftovers we're left with when we come back in here next time. And I'm not worried about the fact that we're not giving them any bedding either, because just like in that other bin here too, we're just seeing little bundles of shredded paper and cardboard stuck together. There's a whole bunch of it all over the place. So to me, it's not only a bedding material, but it's also kind of the balance to their diet, where the kitchen scraps that go in are really high in nitrogen content, whereas the bedding materials eventually no longer serve the function of just being bedding, but they also double as a food source, but a food source that's more rich in carbon, providing them with a good carbon and nitrogen balance. Just like any good composter knows, anyone who has done any composting knows that there's always that balance between the nitrogen content of your composting environment and the carbon. Nitrogen and carbon, they need to be sort of in a specific ratio to achieve that hot composting. But even in the worm bins, the worms need both. So, pretty nice. Things are looking good in here. And even though we had a feeding zone indicator in here, it was so far gone that I just sort of decided it was going to just go in here as supplementary bedding. It's no longer serving as a feeding zone indicator. But I don't think we're going to have too hard of a time realizing where we last fed, because it's just my typical approach anymore these days to pretty much feed most bins down the middle. I know I've got a couple deviations from that, like my mixed worm bin is feeding on the edge, and I've just been moving stuff over, kind of running it as almost like a continuous flow type environment, or a wedge, and that actually works really nicely too. But I've sort of gotten in the habit of just dumping their food right down into the middle, and I kind of like that because worms throughout the material can easily approach it from all sides. Or if this stuff should happen to heat up, because it's, maybe once the bacteria in the system gets into that food and it starts to really start working it down, the temperature might rise in the feeding area for a little while. There too, the worms have plenty of space to get away from it. So I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up, and I'll take care of putting all this stuff away too once the camera stops rolling. But before I do that, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.